Why can't you get any positive stories in the press? Hello, happy Tuesday to you. How's the weather where you are? Sorry to rub it in, but if you are in the northern hemisphere, then I've just been down the beach now that I live in Australia. But it was a good opportunity to have a think about a question from one of you, one of the listeners to this show. I know the person who asked this is listening right now, but I promise not to say their name or who they work for. All I will say is that they work for a public body. And statistically, 47% of people in PR work for public bodies. So it's not a great surprise. But the question, in short, was this: how can you get positive stories out about your public organization when the zeitgeist of media and public perception always seems to take a negative view of you and will find a way to criticize any positive stories? And how can you turn around that attitude as well? So I think there are two things. Number one is that good news is very hard to sell, whatever situation you're in, but it can be done. And two, which I'll cover next time, is that you can turn around a negative perception, but it's going to take some work. I will cover that, as I say, in a few weeks' time, as I'm hoping to have a few chats with a few listeners about their current PR work and their projects in the next few weeks. But that is on its way. So if you aren't subscribed yet, make sure you are. Okay, let's start with the basics. Why can't you get a positive news story in the press? Now, there are multiple studies which show this, but one which is often quoted was performed by John Cacioppo. Now, in the study, they showed positive images such as cars and food to people, and then images of dead animals or a disfigured face, and then more neutral images. And the biggest emotional response by far from all the subjects was to the negative. Our brains literally wake up to negative stories and hardly stir mentally to the positive ones, even when they seem exciting, like a car or something nice. Now, this, when you think about a positive, happy story from an organization that you don't want to hear from, you've got even less chance of waking people up. So whether the public narrative is with you normally or against you, good news just doesn't work well. And journalists know that. So how do you get a good news story that your boss or you would like to get across out there and used? The answer, I think, and I would love to know your views on this, but the answer to me is to wrap a good story in a bad one. Now, as a news editor, I saw lots of these good news stories coming in, and frankly, I binned most of them for the reason I just gave you. You know, the goal of news as a news editor is indeed to produce news to inform people, but it's also to ensure your audience stays tuned into you. Because if you don't have an audience, you're not going to be able to reach anyone. So let me give you an example of one actual case of one story that was pitched to me face-to-face in the UK. Now, one of the UK government's press officers came into our station that I was working at the time, and no one wanted to talk to them, but I've always liked talking to people and trying to help them get across their stories. So I agreed to go downstairs. I walked downstairs in this radio station out into the public areas and went into the cafe to talk to this person. And we sat down in the cafe and started chatting. Now, they were having success, or they were trying to tell me about their success with a scheme designed to reduce teenage drunkenness. And they wanted to promote these projects in the news and hail their success. But no one wanted to just use a good news story. So I asked, well, what was the story pitch? What were they trying to put across? And I can tell you straight away, it was not good. I wouldn't have used it. So I remember the feeling, actually. I sat down, I grabbed a bit of paper and a pen, and I started to work through the story with them and started to really interview them and grill them and find out what the actual ins and outs of this story was. I've done this so many times. So the first thing I told them that a story like this needs a good case study. You know, I need a dramatic story. I don't want do-gooders. I want the hardcore drinkers who had turned their life around. That is a story, not someone that just says, oh, we've done really well. Now, once you've found someone like that, once you've found a case study, and of course I'm not talking about a teenager, I'm talking about someone that's got a bit older so you can get all the permissions right and stuff like that. You then need to make sure that they're going to go and do a good interview, because the inevitable question when interviewing an alcoholic who turned their life around is, well, how did you? How did you turn it around? That's what a journalist is going to say. The worst answer that person could then give would be, well, it was because of a government scheme which has achieved this amazing result. Now, it's understandable that you want them to put that across, but it's going to be an instant turn-off for not just the news organisation, but for listeners as well. So what you want them to do then is to humanise it again. So again, we're giving an answer which is based around human emotion. So in this particular case, let's say hypothetically, Mr. Smith is the person who helped them turn it around. Bring in that emotional journey that they then went on, and then mention the fact that Mr. Smith works for that government department, which is part of a scheme which has achieved some amazing results. by then you've got the audience's buy-in. They're drawn into the story. They're engaged with this emotion. And that final bit, which is actually the bit you're trying to put in there, is then taken on board because it's part of a much better story. So what you've done is you've put the message that you wanted to put out there by wrapping a good story into a negative. The negative carries the positive. And then you want to obviously be thinking, well, where did this teenager live? Where did Mr. Smith live? That's the local angles for the local press. What are the figures for abuse in local areas? That's local angles as well, etc., etc., etc. We could go on about that for hours. Putting out good news is going to be hard, whatever, especially if the zeitgeist is against you. But as I say, I'm going to talk a bit more about that in the upcoming episode. But let me give you another hypothetical example of an even harder situation, perhaps. But it makes a good point. Let's say you are working in a tax office and you want to put out a good news story about taxes. Straight away, you think that's a tall order, right? As much as, you and I hate taxes, we actually know that there's a reason for them. So what is that reason? What does it do? What are the human stories about how those taxes are helping people? Who was the Mrs. Smith, maybe this time, at the tax office? Now, of course, there's another way of getting good news out. If we forget about the traditional media, even if you have a negative zeitgeist, you can, of course, use the same approach on social media. Again, it's not going to work if you have a social media feed full of lots of good, positive stories. It's just like a red rag to a bull. People are going to lay into you. So to connect with people, you need to bring it into humanity again. You need to bring in those human stories. In other words, the person on the feed needs to be authentic and have bad days. It can't just be a list of what our organization is doing. That's, say, red rag to a bull. So you need to have someone who is going to be able to make an update showing that they're pissed off one day and exhausted because they saw something today that shocked them. By doing that, you're going to be illustrating the human side of the work and the positive impact of what they do in a far more powerful way than some positive, fluffy press release. Now, of course, you need the right person for this and they need to be brief, but equally, there's no reason why a PR team member couldn't be doing this themselves on their own feed. Make it human, not corporate. And this is what then carries that message through. And this doesn't have to be time-consuming or expensive. It doesn't need to be a daily edited vlog. It can be that they just sat down at their desk after a long day and wanted to tell their friends. In effect, that feed update for 60 seconds. Very easy to do. I just want to give one final tip, though. By the way, all of this is already in the resources section that you will find on the website. If you head to the menu there, you can click on that. You will find that there. And also, it'll be in the next newsletter next week. So here's the final tip. Demonstrate, don't tell. I think the temptation in public relations is to try and tell the press what the message should be, and it starts to become almost desperate. So the press release will begin with a clear, we want you to do this, in effect. Now, you certainly want to try and frame the story, but as a journalist, your first job is to, well, particularly when someone tries to tell you what the story is to ignore that and to try and find your own story. So you're actually encouraging them to do that. So use a good human story. Use a good case study where the narrative, the story that you want to put across is obvious. It's like with that alcoholic. It's the obvious question is, how did you turn that story around? So use good examples, not just fluffy stuff. Sadly, the science shows that you and I and the people that we're trying to reach are simply not programmed to be interested in fluffy, happy stories. Sad as it is, it's just the reality of it. If you know someone else who might like to hear the story at this show, feel free to share the URL. It is thepublicrelationspodcast.com, thepublicrelationspodcast.com. And don't forget, these are just my views on what I think you need to do if you're trying to get a story across like this. But what do you think? There's a lot of PR agencies listening to this show. I would love to know what you think about it as well. Let me know. And even better, come on the show and tell everyone what you're up to in the campaigns that you are working on as well. I would love to get more listeners on this show talking about your successes and what you're up to and learning as well. You can reach me on LinkedIn at Richard Midson. It is Midson. That's Midson. Okay, I need to have a beer as it is a gorgeous evening here. Speak soon wherever you are in the world, and I hope you have an absolutely awesome week.